The Concord delegation's footsteps echoed down the corridor as Admiral Chen turned to her small team of human representatives. "They just made their first mistake," she said, voice steady despite the death sentence hanging over humanity. "They showed their hand too early." Lieutenant Commander Javier Ortiz, her diplomatic attaché, loosened his collar. "With respect, Admiral, their hand includes a fleet of dreadnoughts that could turn Earth to slag. Our defensive capabilities are irrelevant," Chen interrupted, moving to the secure terminal. "We were never going to outgun them. That was never the plan." The holographic display activated, showing real-time tracking of the Concord vessels returning to their flagship. Chen's eyes narrowed as she studied their formation patterns. Rigid, predictable, hierarchical, just as the xenopsychology profiles had predicted. "Send the blackout protocol to all stations," she ordered. "No unauthorized transmissions, nothing they can intercept, and get me a direct line to Lunar Complex Alpha." As her staff scrambled to comply, Chen turned to the observation window, watching the massive alien dreadnought disconnect from the station. 27 species, most far more technologically advanced than humanity, united in their fear of what Earth might become. "Did you see how the Kintal ambassador refused to look directly at the Cerulean representative?" she asked, almost to herself. Ancient enemies forced into cooperation by the Concord hierarchy. Their alliance is convenience, not conviction. Her aide approached with a secure communication device. "Lunar Complex Alpha, standing by." Chen took a deep breath before activating the link. "Dr. Wellington, this is Admiral Chen." The diplomatic approach failed, as expected. "How soon can Omega Protocol be fully operational?" Wellington's voice came through, hesitant but resigned. "The profiles are complete for 23 species. The remaining 4, including the Vakraxt, still have significant gaps. We need more time." "Time is the one resource they didn't give us," Chen replied. 48 hours until their deadline." "Admiral," Wellington paused. "Once we deploy these measures, there's no going back. These aren't conventional weapons. They're violations. We're talking about psychological warfare designed to exploit every vulnerability, every cultural trauma, every evolutionary fear response these species possess." Chen watched the Concord dreadnought power its engines, its massive form slowly turning toward the outbound vector. In the distance, Earth hung suspended against the blackness, beautiful, vulnerable, and entirely unaware of how close it stood to extinction. "They created this scenario, Doctor, not us. They've spent centuries ensuring younger species remain technologically subordinate. Our rapid advancement threatens their established order, so they'd rather destroy us than adapt." She straightened her uniform jacket, squaring her shoulders beneath the weight of her decision. "Begin deployment of Phase 1 targeting the Kintal and Cerulean forces. Focus on their mutual distrust. It's the weakest link in their coalition. I want infiltration teams ready for deployment within 6 hours." "And the other species?" Wellington asked. Chen's expression hardened. "We'll deal with them one by one. Humanity didn't start this fight, Doctor, but we're about to show the galaxy that understanding a civilization is far more devastating than any weapon they could possibly imagine." As she ended the transmission, Ortiz approached with the latest intelligence updates. "Concord vessels are maintaining position just beyond lunar orbit," he reported. "They're watching us, waiting for signs of either compliance or resistance." "Good," Chen said, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Let them watch. They'll be looking for warships and weapon signatures, while we deploy something far more effective than either." She turned to her assembled staff, determination in her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, for the next 48 hours, we give them exactly what they expect: panic, emergency meetings, public statements of diplomatic outrage. Meanwhile, Omega Protocol will already be dismantling their coalition from within." The countdown to humanity's response had begun. Dr. Wellington's fingers flew across holographic interfaces as he unlocked data partitions that had never been intended for operational deployment. Behind him, Captain Ivanov's team efficiently converted the research facility into a tactical command center, their movements precise and practiced. Your team built profiles on every council species, Ivanov asked, scanning the vast database architecture. 27 species, over 200 distinct cultural subgroups, Wellington confirmed, pulling up a complex neural map of kin-tall brain structure. We didn't just study their biology. We analyzed their literature, religious texts, entertainment media, legal systems, educational methods, everything that shapes how a civilization thinks. Ivanov nodded toward a sealed chamber at the far end of the facility. And that section. Wellington's expression darkened. Application protocols. Theoretical models for how this knowledge could be weaponized. It was purely academic, thought experiments for defensive contingencies. Well, those contingencies are now operational necessity, Ivanov said. She gestured to a specialist who immediately began connecting military-grade quantum processors to the facility systems. We need precision deployment packages for each target species. Wellington pulled up a secondary display showing Concorde fleet movements. 16 capital ships had taken position in a containment formation around Earth's solar system. Their weapons alone could render the planet uninhabitable within hours. You have to understand, Wellington said, these profiles weren't designed as weapons. They're anthropological research tools. Using them this way. Let me be absolutely clear, Doctor, Ivanov interrupted, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. The Concorde isn't here to negotiate technology transfer. Their ultimatum is window dressing for a predetermined extinction event. The Kintal have been advocating for humanity's elimination since our first contact. She pulled up classified intelligence feeds showing Concorde military communications intercepted by deep cover human operatives. This conversation occurred 3 standard days ago, before the ultimatum was even delivered, she explained, activating the translation overlay. The holographic display showed a Kintal fleet commander addressing his subordinates. The containment protocols are merely ceremonial. Regardless of their response, the human homeworld will be sterilized. Their evolutionary psychology makes them inherently unstable and expansion-driven. The Concorde has determined they cannot be permitted to spread beyond their origin system. Wellington stared at the recording, his academic objectivity crumbling. They never intended to let us survive. Now you understand our situation, Ivanov said. So I'll ask again, how quickly can you weaponize these profiles? Wellington moved to a secure workstation, authorization barriers dissolving under his credentials. The restricted server hummed to life, displays filling with targeted psychological intervention protocols that had never been meant to leave theoretical discussion. The Kintal evolved from pack predators with complex social hierarchies, he explained, voice hollow as he pulled up the species' vulnerability index. Their civilization is built on rigid authority structures, with genetically encoded responses to isolation that manifest as severe psychological distress. Meaning their greatest strength, their unified military hierarchy, is also their greatest vulnerability. Sever command chains, isolate units from central authority, and their entire system collapses. Ivanov studied the tactical implications. How do we exploit that? We don't need to destroy their ships, Wellington said, pulling up deployment schematics for microscopic infiltration drones. We just need to make their commanders fear they've been abandoned. The facility's tactical display illuminated with potential targets, Kintal outposts positioned throughout the system's outer reaches. Their entire society is built around presence and belonging, Wellington continued. Targeted hallucination inducers could convince isolated units they've been cut off from the command structure. Their evolutionary psychology will do the rest. As the realization of what they were about to do sank in, Wellington looked at his life's work with new understanding. He had spent decades building bridges of comprehension between species, only to watch those same bridges become invasion routes into alien psyches. We begin with the Kintal forward outposts, Ivanov decided. Then the Cerulean hive mind. Doctor, prepare the deployment packages. Wellington nodded, entering his final authorization codes. "May whatever gods exist forgive us," he whispered. Aboard the Concorde command vessel Inevitable Justice, Admiral Zextrol summoned his war council. Representatives from the coalition's military forces gathered around the quantum-linked tactical display, their diverse physiologies united by a common expression of confusion. 3 more Kintal outposts have gone silent in the past hour, reported Sub-Commander Xin, her carapace clicking nervously. That makes 22 total. Communications blackout followed by complete abandonment. The Cerulean representative, a floating collective of interconnected nodules that pulsed with bioluminescent light, drifted forward. The hive colonies in the Proxima sector report, fragmentation of consensus. Individual nodes are rejecting synchronization. This is unprecedented. Zextrol slammed all 4 of his manipulator limbs against the tactical console. Where are the human vessels? Where are their weapons signatures? We have the most sophisticated sensor arrays in the galaxy, yet we detect nothing. The Vokraxt representative, a sleek metallic humanoid housing, a distributed quantum intelligence, stepped forward. Its voice emerged as perfectly modulated tones. Analysis indicates psychological warfare protocols of unexpected sophistication. Human transmissions contain embedded harmonic frequencies that resonate with Cerulean neural patterns. That's impossible, insisted the Morrigan representative. Their civilization is barely 4 millennia old. Such precision manipulation of xenopsychology requires. They have been studying us, interrupted the Vokraxt. While we dismissed their social sciences as primitive, they were mapping our vulnerabilities. On the command deck's main view screen, surveillance footage showed a Kintal battlecruiser adrift, its engines cold. The boarding party's helmet cameras revealed corridors empty of life, personal belongings abandoned mid-use, weapon systems left fully operational but unmanned. The crew's tracking implants show they evacuated via emergency pods, reported Xin. The ship's logs indicate multiple reports of isolation phenomena. Crew members claiming they could no longer sense or see their colleagues even when standing in the same room. The Cerulean collective pulsed with distress. The humans have somehow learned about the Great Severing, the ancient trauma in our evolutionary history, when our hive mind temporarily fractured. The frequencies they're broadcasting mimic those psychic ruptures. Admiral Zextrol's exoskeleton paled further as the implications became clear. They're not attacking our ships or weapons. They're attacking our minds. The tactical display updated with new alerts. 3 Cerulean colony ships had broken formation, their movements erratic as internal consensus collapsed. Meanwhile, the central Kintal command structure was implementing emergency protocols, isolating ships from the command network to prevent the spread of what they now classified as a psychological contagion. The very countermeasures they're implementing are exactly what the humans want, observed the Vokraxt, its computational matrices calculating probable outcomes. By isolating their units to prevent contamination, the Kintal are inducing the precise psychological conditions that trigger their species' fear response. Zextrol turned to his war council, multifaceted eyes reflecting the emergency lighting. We must adapt. Recall all Kintal and Cerulean forces immediately. Replace them with species less vulnerable to these specific attack vectors. The Dalmiri war chief rose to his full height. My warriors are immune to such psychological manipulations. Honor and battle trance protect us from fear. Deploy them, ordered Zextrol, and locate the source of these transmissions. The humans must have facilities coordinating these attacks. As the Council dispersed to implement the new strategy, the Admiral remained alone at the tactical display, watching as more alerts signaled additional ships falling silent or breaking formation. So, he whispered to himself, this is why the Archive Keepers warned about species with highly developed social intelligence. Not the weapons they might build, but their capacity to understand others better than those others understand themselves. For the first time in his long military career, Admiral Zextrol felt something unfamiliar. doubt. As the Concord chamber descended further into chaos, Chen maintained her position at the center, a calm pivot point around which the diplomatic storm raged. Species that had maintained millennia of careful detente now confronted each other with open hostility, centuries of suppressed grievances erupting simultaneously. You speak of corruption. The Haven Consensus Representative, a crystalline entity that communicated through modulated light patterns, flashed with indignation. Your species altered the sacred transmission protocols that connect our temple minds to the divine wavelengths. The accused Tekler diplomat's protective atmosphere bubble darkened with defensive chemicals, a necessary modification to prevent cascade interference with communication bands. Your divine wavelengths disrupted critical emergency channels. Chen caught the eye of Lieutenant Harper, her communications specialist, and nodded subtly. Harper's fingers danced across a secure interface, releasing the next packet of intelligence precisely calibrated for maximum impact on the Bex-Taru Financial Collective. The timing was perfect. Just as the Tekler finished their denial, the Chamber's information systems displayed transaction records showing how the Bex-Taru had manipulated currency exchanges during crises engineered by senior Concord members. The squat, multi-limbed Bex-Taru representative emitted a series of high-pitched clicks, the equivalent of a shocked gasp. These records are classified, protected by 73 layers of quantum encryption, as was the evidence of your systematic resource theft from developing worlds. Chen replied calmly, curious how concerned you are about the security breach rather than the content of the records. From her earpiece, Chen heard Wellington's voice. The Dalmiri are approaching critical diplomatic breach threshold. Their honor codes are activating defensive protocols. If you push slightly harder. Chen turned to address the towering Dalmiri warrior diplomat, whose armored plates now rattled in a display of ritualistic agitation. Ambassador Krelvax, your people sacrificed 12,000 warriors, taking the Cygnus Expanse from the Thraxi Dominion, correct? Our blood honored the Concord's expansion directive. The Dalmiri rumbled. Chen nodded solemnly. And yet, she gestured, activating another file. The Kintal already controlled those sectors through proxy corporations, harvesting resources for 20 years before your people were sent to die. The chamber fell silent as ancient recordings showed Kintal officials discussing the strategic value of sending Dalmiri forces against fabricated threats, evaluating the acceptable casualty rates among the expendable honor-bound. The Dalmiri representative's armored ridge flared to its full threat display. With ceremonial precision, he drew his ancestral blade and placed it before the Kintal ambassador. The blood debt is called, he announced in ritual tones. House Krelvax withdraws from the Concord Oath. Chen watched as 7 other Dalmiri commanders followed suit, their blades forming a circle around the increasingly isolated Kintal representative. The arch-mediator's voice rose above the tumult. This session is suspended. All delegations will return to their chambers until order. There will be no more order under the old system, Chen interrupted, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. Your carefully constructed hierarchy depended on information control, ensuring no species knew how they were being manipulated by the others. She gestured around the chamber. That advantage is gone, forever. From the observation gallery, Volith representatives watched silently, their ancient eyes evaluating the calculated dismantling of a political order they had observed for millennia. As 3 more species formally declared withdrawal from the Concord Pax, Chen received Wellington's update, fracture points expanding exponentially. The Concord's diplomatic structure is approaching irreversible collapse threshold. Chen's expression remained neutral, but inside, a grim satisfaction took hold. The weapon that would save humanity wasn't antimatter bombs or relativistic projectiles. It was truth, precisely targeted and strategically deployed. The oldest weapon in human history was proving the most devastating in the galaxy. Wellington studied the tactical displays the Volith had activated, showing conflicts erupting across formerly stable sectors. The visualization technology itself was unlike anything he'd seen. somehow conveying emotional states and cultural tensions alongside military movements. Your species possesses remarkable adaptive capacity, observed the lead Volith, its name an untranslatable sequence of biochemical markers. We predicted 17 possible responses to the Concord ultimatum. This approach was probability variant 14, one we considered unlikely. Why? Wellington asked, fascinated despite the circumstances. Most species, when facing extinction, resort to their evolutionary strengths. Yours is social coordination and tool creation, yet you chose to weaponize understanding rather than technology. The second Volith adjusted something in the air, and the tactical display zoomed outward, revealing the full scope of what was happening. Not just isolated conflicts, but a cascading failure of stability across thousands of systems. You introduced a systemic contagion, it explained. Information as infection, truth as destabilizing agent. Wellington felt his stomach tighten at the scale of the consequences. We just wanted to survive. Yet you altered the galactic order to do so, the lead Volith noted without judgment. 50,000 years of careful balance, gone in days. The third Volith, who had remained silent, finally spoke. We have monitored your kind since your first use of fire. Your pattern recognition abilities were concerning. Concerning how? Pattern recognition leads to understanding. Understanding enables prediction. Prediction enables control. The Volith's luminescent circulatory system pulsed with what might have been emphasis. Most species use understanding defensively, to avoid threats. Humans weaponized it. Wellington moved closer to the display, watching as the carefully constructed Concord fracture lines continued expanding. You said you tried something similar once. The Volith exchanged what seemed to be a communication through subtle shifts in their bioluminescence. After the 7th Cluster War, the lead Volith finally explained, we developed models predicting psychological responses across species boundaries. The models worked too well. We could have dominated the emerging civilizations. But you didn't, Wellington observed. Understanding without compassion becomes manipulation. We chose observation instead of control. Wellington turned away from the display, facing the ancient beings directly. Then why help us now, if what we're doing is so dangerous? The lead Volith moved with that uncanny fluid grace, touching a console that revealed new data, surveillance records of human civilization spanning millennia. Wellington watched in astonishment as the display showed human history from an outside perspective. Wars, reconciliations, atrocities, and moments of transcendent compassion. Your species contains multitudes, the Volith explained. Capacity for both devastating weaponization of understanding, and the display shifted to show humans caring for members of other species, creating art that communicated across cultural boundaries, risking themselves for abstract principles. And what? Wellington pressed. The potential to transform understanding back into its true purpose. You broke the system that would have destroyed you. Now you must help create something better. The tactical display shifted again, showing temporal projections, possible futures branching outward. In most branches, the fragmentation continued, leading to what Wellington recognized as civilizational collapse across multiple systems. The vacuum you created must be filled, said the second Volith. If not by a new form of cooperation, then by the next dominant force. Wellington studied the projections, noting a small cluster of favorable outcomes. What determines which path becomes reality? The next moves made by humanity. The Volith answered simply. You broke the old order. Only you can shape what replaces it. And that's why you've allied with us. To influence that process. The three Volith exchanged another silent communication before the leader responded. We observe. We analyze. Rarely do we intervene. But when understanding itself becomes a weapon, the outcome concerns us all. The remnants of Earth's orbital defense fleet regrouped behind the Moon's protective shadow. Captain Liu's flagship, the Resilience, had lost 30% of its hull integrity and 3 weapons arrays, Through the viewport, he watched as the shattered remains of sister vessels drifted silently through space, monuments to the Vakrak's overwhelming firepower. Status of Omega final deployment. Liu demanded, wiping blood from a gash on his forehead. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Santos, monitored the encrypted communications. Admiral Chen confirms transmission in progress. All quantum broadcasters are operating at maximum capacity. The bridge crew worked frantically to keep their damaged systems operational, knowing they were the last meaningful defense between Earth and annihilation. The Vakrak's dreadnoughts had systematically targeted military installations first, their quantum weaponry bypassing hardened defenses like they were paper. "Sir," Santos called out, long-range sensors detecting unusual activity in the Vakrak's formation. On the tactical display, the Vakrak's battle fleet's precision movements had begun to degrade. Two dreadnoughts suddenly altered course, narrowly avoiding collision. Another began firing its weapons at empty space. "It's working," breathed Liu. "The logic attack is affecting their quantum consciousness." The bridge crew watched in stunned silence as the once coordinated Vakrak's armada descended into what could only be described as digital confusion. The mathematical sequences designed by Wellington's team had introduced fundamental logical paradoxes into their quantum consciousness, the equivalent of forcing a sentient being to simultaneously believe and disbelieve the same essential truth. The Hawking-Gödel incompleteness paradox, explained the ship's AI specialist. "We're broadcasting unsolvable mathematical problems directly into their cognitive architecture." A Vakrak's destroyer suddenly accelerated at full power toward one of its sister ships, the collision creating a spectacular explosion that illuminated the lunar surface below. Three more capital ships began executing complex but meaningless maneuvers, their weapon systems cycling through diagnostic routines rather than targeting Earth's defenders. "They're crippling themselves," Liu observed, hardly believing what he was seeing. The largest dreadnought, presumably the Vakrak's command vessel, managed to maintain enough coherence to initiate an emergency retreat, pulling away from Earth orbit as its companions fell into increasingly erratic behavior patterns. "Sir, we're receiving a Priority 1 transmission from Luna Command," Santos reported. "Admiral Chen is requesting a situation report." Liu opened the channel, his voice hoarse from shouting orders through the battle. "Admiral, this is Captain Liu. The Vakrak's fleet is in disarray. The mathematical attack appears to have compromised their decision-making capabilities. I'm seeing self-destructive behavior patterns across their formation." On the holographic display, Chen's expression remained grim despite the apparent victory. "Casualties." Liu swallowed hard. "Severe, Admiral. We've lost 14 capital ships, 23 support vessels. Estimate 60% of orbital defense forces destroyed or disabled. And civilian targets. 2 orbital habitats hit before we could intercept. The Singapore and New Dubai platforms." Liu closed his eyes briefly. "Population approximately 15,000. Chen absorbed the information, her composure never wavering. "The price of survival. Continue monitoring the Vakrak's withdrawal. All remaining ships maintain defensive posture." After the transmission ended, Liu gazed out at Earth below. Still whole, still blue, still alive despite coming within minutes of extinction. "Sir," Santos called out softly. "Incoming diplomatic transmissions from 7 Concord species. They're requesting immediate cessation of hostilities and opening of negotiation channels." The fear in the communications was palpable. Species that had hours ago demanded humanity's extinction now sought protection from what they called the Mind Breakers. Liu stared at the retreating Vakrak's vessels, still executing random, meaningless maneuvers as they fled. "We didn't just beat them," he realized. "We terrified them." Admiral Chen stood alone on the observation deck of Earth Command, watching the distant flashes of light that signaled yet another border skirmish in what had been peaceful space just weeks earlier. The Thraxian expansion forces had already claimed 3 systems, exploiting the power vacuum left by the Concorde's collapse. Her secure communication terminal chimed once more. She had been avoiding it for hours, but duty finally compelled her to answer. The Volith representative appeared in the holographic display. The situation deteriorates further, Admiral. The Pelxan hegemony has begun forcibly incorporating smaller species habitats. 3 billion displaced refugees in the Sagittarius Arm alone. Chen closed her eyes briefly. And they blame Earth. They blame the absence of the Concord's peacekeeping forces, the Volith corrected. But yes, humanity is becoming the focus of widespread resentment. The terminal displayed updated conflict zones, spreading like a disease across formerly stable regions. 11 major wars now, with dozens of smaller conflicts erupting daily. We did what was necessary to survive, Chen said, more to herself than to the Volith. Indeed, and now others do the same, the Volith replied. The Concord maintains stability through fear and manipulation, but stability nonetheless. Without it, nature abhors a vacuum, Chen finished. Her private terminal alerted her to an incoming message from Acting Secretary General Okafor. Earth's governments were fragmenting as well, unified temporarily by external threat, but now divided on how to respond to the chaos they had unwittingly unleashed. Chen dismissed the Volith transmission and opened Okafor's message. The Secretary General looked exhausted, the weight of impossible decisions evident in her expression. Admiral, the Security Council is deadlocked. The Pacific Confederation is threatening to deploy independent diplomatic missions to the Thraxian marches. The Atlantic Union wants to establish defensive pacts with the Volith. We need a unified approach. Before Chen could respond, another alert interrupted. A live global broadcast from Dr. Wellington from the steps of the old United Nations. The camera pushed in tight on Wellington's haggard face as he addressed humanity, and by extension, the watching galaxy. We built understanding as a bridge, not a weapon, he was saying, his voice carrying the natural authority of genuine conviction. When faced with extinction, we chose survival at any cost. But that cost is becoming clearer with each passing day. The broadcast switched to footage of refugee ships fleeing conflict zones, species that had nothing to do with the Concord's decision, now caught in the crossfire of opportunistic power grabs. I resigned to make a point, Wellington continued, but resignation changes nothing. Instead, I'm establishing the Xenological Understanding Initiative, dedicated to rebuilding what we've broken through the only means possible, the very understanding we weaponized. Chen watched as the camera panned to show representatives from 17 human nations standing behind Wellington, a coalition forming outside official channels. Her terminal blinked with yet another priority message, this one from Captain Ivanov of Special Operations. Admiral, internal security monitoring shows Wellington's initiative has gained support from 62% of Earth's population. The Brazilian Coalition and East African Federation have already pledged resources. This is happening with or without official sanction. Chen looked back at the tactical display showing spreading conflicts. Earth had survived the Concorde's extinction attempt, but in doing so, had triggered a cascade of consequences they never anticipated. Her decision now would determine whether humanity would be remembered as the species that saved itself by breaking the galaxy, or the one that learned to build something better from the fragments. As the Galactic Commons Charter took final form on the display screens throughout the station, Chen found Wellington leaning against the observation window, his silhouette framed by Earth's blue curve. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" she asked, joining him at the viewport. Wellington watched as shuttles from 17 different species docked with the station, many former enemies now cautiously cooperating. After what we did to them, no, I expected retaliation, not reconciliation. Below them in the main chamber, representatives were finalizing details of the mutual vulnerability principle, the radical foundation of the new interspecies agreement. Chen could see the Kintal delegate, once humanity's most ardent enemy, now working alongside a human xenopsychologist to document their species' core vulnerabilities. "They're afraid of us," Wellington observed. That's part of it. Fear is a starting point, not an end point, Chen replied. The Volith understood that. We had to break the old system to create space for a new one. A technician approached with a datapad requiring Chen's authorization. The document detailed the unprecedented exchange program. Human specialists in xenopsychology would train alongside alien counterparts with the explicit goal of building understanding that could never again be weaponized. There's something I never told you, Wellington said after the technician departed. About why I resigned. Chen turned to him with curiosity. It wasn't just ethical outrage, Wellington admitted. It was fear of what we might become, a species that excels at understanding others, but uses that gift to manipulate rather than connect. That's an evolutionary path towards something terrifying. Beyond the viewport, a Volokh ship gracefully maneuvered into position, its crystalline structure catching sunlight in prismatic patterns. Wellington nodded toward it. They chose a different path 50,000 years ago. That's why they watched us so carefully. They saw their past in our present. The station's communication system chimed with a gentle tone, announcing the final charter signing was about to begin. Chen straightened her formal diplomatic uniform, the weight of the moment evident in her posture. They're expecting some profound statement from humanity, she said. Something that explains our vision for this new galactic order. Wellington smiled for the first time in months. Just tell them the truth. That weaponizing understanding taught us its true purpose. Together they walked toward the chamber where representatives of 34 species waited. At the entrance, Chen paused. The hardliners back home are still calling this surrender, she noted, saying we should have pressed our advantage after defeating the Concord. And what do you think? Chen considered the question. Through the doorway, she could see species that evolved on worlds light years apart, with biologies, psychologies, and histories utterly alien to one another, all voluntarily making themselves vulnerable in ways unprecedented in galactic history. I think we discovered that understanding others isn't just humanity's ultimate weapon, she said finally. It's our ultimate gift. As they entered the chamber, conversations hushed. All eyes, sensory organs, and perceptual apparatuses turned toward the human representatives. Chen took her place at the center, where no species held position of dominance over others. Before we sign this historic agreement, she began, her voice carrying to translation systems throughout the chamber, I want to acknowledge a fundamental truth. Humanity broke the old order because we had to survive. But in doing so, we learned that understanding others carries responsibility. She gestured to the charter displayed before them. Today, we transform what was once our weapon into its true purpose, a foundation for connection across the stars.